For over 5 decades, Dustin Hoffman has been a titan of the big screen. From The Graduate to Rain Man, his performances are burned into Hollywood history. But what most people don't realize is that behind the awards and accolades, there's a much darker story, one filled with personal grudges, explosive feuds, and behind-scenes tension that no director ever wanted the public to see. Now, after years of silence, whispers are turning into headlines. Hoffman has finally let slip the names of 5 actors he absolutely couldn't stand working with. Not just petty disagreements, these were full-on breakdowns in trust, clashes of ego, and moments that nearly derailed major productions. Some of these names will shock you. Others you might have seen the tension on screen and never realized it was real. What's even more surprising is the way Hoffman handled it. Sometimes aggressively, sometimes in silence, but always with consequences. So, who made the list? And what exactly happened to turn collaboration into chaos? Let's just say some stories were never meant to be told until now. When Kramer vs. Kramer premiered in 1979, critics hailed it as a raw, emotional masterpiece. 2 towering performances that tore open the complexities of divorce, parenting, and loss. But what the cameras didn't catch was the real storm brewing between Dustin Hoffman and a young Meryl Streep, one that would go on to define one of Hollywood's most uncomfortable behind-scenes feuds. The friction started almost immediately. Hoffman, already an industry heavyweight, was deep into his method acting phase. He didn't just play a character, he became one. And that obsession with authenticity led him to do things that crossed the line badly. During rehearsals and even takes, he'd ignore the script, hurling unexpected insults at Streep to provoke genuine emotion. In one infamous moment, he even slapped her across the face without warning and without her consent. But what really shattered the trust was a personal jab that had nothing to do with the film. In the middle of a scene, Hoffman reportedly brought up Stur's fiancé, John Cazale, who had recently passed away from cancer. The two had been deeply in love, and the wound was still fresh. Stur later admitted the comment devastated her, but she kept going, pushing through the scene with real tears that weren't in the script. From Hoffman's perspective, it was just another tool, something to get a more authentic reaction. But for Street, it was a betrayal. She wasn't acting anymore, she was enduring. Behind the scenes, the atmosphere grew tense and hostile. There were no friendly chats between takes, no mutual respect building off camera. It was all business, and not the kind that builds long-term trust. Hoffman's domineering energy on set made Street feel like a target, not a co-star. The irony. Their volatile chemistry made the film a massive success. Kramer vs. Kramer swept the Oscars. Hoffman and Stur both won, but when it came time to celebrate, they did it from opposite corners of the room. The pain lingered for decades. Years later, in interviews, Stur spoke more openly about what really happened. She didn't name names at first, but her meaning was clear. Hoffman, for his part, gave lukewarm apologies, often chalking up the behavior to the method or simply saying it was the 70s. But time hasn't softened the blow. Stur never worked with him again, and likely never will. It was a performance that earned them both gold statues. But behind the scenes, it was a relationship defined by silence, tension, and a complete collapse of trust. And if that wasn't uncomfortable, enough. The next feud came from someone who wasn't even acting. He was calling the shots, but Dustin Hoffman didn't care. And that's when things exploded. You'd think working with an acclaimed director would make things easier for a perfectionist like Dustin Hoffman. But with Sydney Pollack, it did the opposite. Their collaboration on Tootsie quickly devolved into a creative cage match that nearly tore the entire production apart. The problem started before the cameras even rolled. Pollack initially didn't want to direct Tootsie at all. He saw it as a career risk until Hoffman convinced him otherwise, or rather tricked him. In Pollack's own words, Hoffman lied to get him on board, promising a different kind of film than what ended up being made. That deception set the tone for everything that followed. Once they were on set, the atmosphere got worse. Hoffman was obsessed with the emotional authenticity of the character, while Pollack wanted a cleaner, more comedic tone. Every scene became a battle, every line a negotiation. They clashed over wardrobe, makeup, tone, even the way Hoffman walked as his female alter ego. Hoffman accused Pollack of trying to neuter the character, while Pollack fired back that Hoffman was making things unbearable for the crew. At one point, the tension got so bad that Pollack, who hadn't planned to act in the film, ended up casting himself as Hoffman's agent just so he could control his behavior on set. That's right, the director stepped into the movie to keep his star in line. Even after Tucci became a massive hit and was nominated for 10 Oscars, the bad blood didn't fade. Hoffman later described Pollack as a control freak. Pollack in turn admitted that working with Hoffman made him question whether the success was even worth it. For the rest of their lives, they never worked together again. No friendly tributes, just a shared legacy built on mutual talent and mutual resentment. But if Hoffman couldn't even get along with his own director, what happened when he clashed with another acting legend? On paper, it sounded like a dream pairing. Dustin Hoffman, the king of method acting, alongside Laurence Olivier, the Shakespearean titan. In reality, it was a philosophical disaster. The film was Marathon Man, a gritty psychological thriller that required both actors to dig deep. Hoffman prepared the only way he knew how, by living the role. For a scene where his character was sleep-deprived and terrified, Hoffman actually stayed awake for days. He wanted the desperation in his eyes to be real. But when he arrived on set, exhausted and barely coherent, Olivier was unimpressed. That wasn't just sarcasm. It was a dagger to Hoffman's entire process. Olivier, a classically trained performer, believed acting was a craft, not a breakdown. He saw Hoffman's extremes as indulgent, even self-destructive. Hoffman, on the other hand, viewed Olivier as out of touch, clinging to tradition while real art was happening in the trenches. Their tension simmered quietly during filming. No screaming matches, no tabloid blow-ups, just cold professional distance and a deep lack of respect. Off-set, they barely spoke. On set, they tolerated each other at best. Despite their differences, Marathon Man became a cult classic. But fans watching those scenes of psychological torment had no idea the real struggle wasn't between characters. It was between two acting giants who couldn't agree on what acting even was. And while Olivier's dig was iconic, the next name on the list brought more than just sharp words. He brought chaos, clashing egos, and one of the biggest box office disasters of the decade. If there's one film that haunts Dustin Hoffman's career, it's Ishtar. Originally hyped as a buddy comedy starring Hoffman and Warren Beatty, it quickly became one of the most infamous box office disasters in Hollywood history. But behind the film's failure was something far more combustible. Two massive egos locked in a slow-motion implosion. Hoffman and Beatty couldn't have been more different. Beatty was polished, controlled, and meticulous, always concerned with how he appeared on screen. Hoffman, meanwhile, thrived on rawness and spontaneity, constantly pushing for rewrites and improvisations that clashed with Beatty's perfectionism. To make things worse, both saw themselves as the real lead, and neither was willing to take a back seat. The result? Creative paralysis. Every scene became a power struggle. The director, Elaine May, was caught in the crossfire, often forced to shoot multiple versions of the same scene to satisfy both actors. The production ballooned out of control with delays, reshoots, and a final budget that spun past $50 million, an astronomical figure at the time. Off-camera, things weren't any better. Hoffman allegedly mocked Beatty's vanity, while Beatty reportedly accused Hoffman of trying to sabotage the film. The two were civil for the press, but behind closed doors, the tension was undeniable. What should have been a lighthearted comedy became a torturous shoot that nearly ruined multiple careers. When Ishtar finally dropped, it flopped hard. Critics ripped it apart. Audiences stayed away. And while both actors tried to downplay their differences in later years, those who were on set knew the truth. The film wasn't just cursed by bad writing, it was sunk by a toxic collaboration that had no hope of working. But even before the Ishtar disaster, Hoffman's reputation for intensity had already rubbed other actors the wrong way, including one of his earliest co-stars who would quietly carry a grudge for decades. Midnight Cowboy made history. It was the first and only X-rated film to win Best Picture at the Oscars. And its two leads, Dustin Hoffman and Jon Voight, gave performances that would define their careers. But what most people don't realize is just how cold things were between them behind the scenes. Hoffman was already deeply immersed in his method acting philosophy by the time cameras rolled. He transformed into Ratso Rizzo, limping, coughing, greasy, and unrecognizable. Voight, still early in his rise, took a more traditional approach. From the start, there was friction, not explosive, but constant. They weren't yelling at each other between takes, but they also weren't speaking, unless